Greetings to all lovers of ancient Greek history. There's no doubt that the ancient Greeks turned love into a philosophical masterpiece. Imagine a world where the lines between passion and deep contemplation blur, where conversations about desire become subjects of intellectual discourse. The ancient Greeks didn't just experience love, they elevated it to the level of philosophical dialogue. What if I told you that their understanding of passion and desire still echoes through the corridors of time, waiting to be rediscovered? Today, we embark on a journey into the tantalizing world of ancient Greek sexuality, a fascinating adventure where philosophy meets passion and gods intertwine with mortals. Buckle up, because we're about to unravel the captivating mysteries of sex and love in ancient Greece. Ancient Greece is called the cradle of civilization because it gave us philosophy, medicine, democracy, and much more. Its principal city-state was Athens, and its golden age was the 5th century BC, when the city flourished and grew wealthy. This was the time when the philosopher Socrates lived, and under the supervision of the incomparable Phidias, the Acropolis with the Parthenon was built. Phidias himself created an incredible frieze that has amazed humanity with its grace for 25 centuries. During those years, one of the most famous rulers of ancient Greece, the proponent of democracy, Pericles, ruled for 32 years. Year after year, he was elected the first of 10 strategoi. He was a military leader and the organizer of the city's construction, especially of the Acropolis and its crown jewel, the Parthenon. Pericles was handsome, intelligent, noble, and honest. He didn't visit others' homes to avoid being suspected of showing favoritism. By his side was his beloved wife, Aspasia, who helped him in many matters, listening, advising, and understanding him. For her, Pericles left his wife and 2 children, risking his reputation. The thing was, Aspasia was a foreigner, not a citizen of Athens. Decent people didn't marry such women at all. Moreover, she was a well-known courtesan, a hetaira, as they called it. A first lady from the lower class, this was unthinkable. But Pericles made his choice, and their relationship became the talk of the town. Before we delve into the topic of sex in ancient Greece, let me say that eroticism was an integral part of their lives. Eroticism wasn't just in everyday life. Statues of Hermes with a phallus, called Hermes, stood on city streets. It was part of their religion. The Olympian gods often gave in to passion, which was reflected in art, literature, public life, entertainment, festivals, and, of course, theater. You probably know that actors wore various masks, but they also often wore enormous leather phalluses for comedic effect. Aristotle wrote that comedy originated from phallic processions, a favorite festival in honor of Dionysus, the god of wine, during which large phalluses were paraded around and revelry ensued. As for love, in the Greek pantheon, it was governed by the goddess Aphrodite. In the 4th century BC, she was divided into 2 forms: exalted, heavenly love, Aphrodite Urania, and Aphrodite Pandemos, who was responsible for earthly, physical love, particularly prostitution. Prostitution was very widespread in ancient Greece. Being a wife in ancient Greece was incredibly dull. The famous quote attributed to Demosthenes goes, "We have hetaira for pleasure, concubines for daily needs, and wives to bear us legitimate children and to be faithful guardians of our households." Greek wives were essentially confined to their homes. After marriage, their duties were to care for the children and the home. They weren't chosen for beauty, but for their ability to bear healthy offspring. Rarely did a wife attend events, walk the streets alone, engage in sports, or participate in politics. Her world was the home and children. When her husband hosted a feast, she was expected to stay in her part of the house and not show herself. At the same time, Greeks were quite accepting of extramarital affairs for men. They could sleep with slaves, hetaira, and even boys, such were the customs. However, this didn't necessarily mean bad relationships between husband and wife. Marriage was considered a duty to the gods, and children were the key to continuing the family line and preserving the state. Interestingly, the Greeks noted that women aged faster than men, so girls were married off as soon as they reached sexual maturity, while men typically married around the age of 30. Engagements and marriages in Athens were fairly traditional. The marriage was arranged, the wedding was held, and that was it. But in Sparta, there was an interesting custom called mock abduction. The bride's parents knew about it, but it was staged as an abduction. The girl would be met by another woman, her hair cut short, dressed in a man's cloak, and left alone in a dark room on a bed of leaves. The groom would come to her, not drunk but alert, carry her to the bed, and consummate the marriage before leaving. This practice continued for some time, with the bride and groom meeting in secret so no one would see them together during the day. These secret meetings even continued after children were born. The reason for this was to maintain passion in the marriage, which, as Plutarch wrote, helped keep the relationship fresh. Spartans could also temporarily loan their wives to other men if they thought the union would produce more beautiful and stronger offspring. This was important for strengthening the Spartan military, as Spartans were first and foremost warriors. Now, let's return to Athens. As mentioned earlier, wives did not attend feasts with men. However, over time, men began to invite hetaira to liven up the company. Hetaira were the upper class of prostitutes, and they stood out from regular women because of their beauty, education, and ability to engage in intellectual conversations. The golden age of hetaira was in the 3rd century BC. Many hetaira were not simply slaves, but free women who worked for themselves. They had their own clients, including rulers, generals, and aristocrats. Hetaira stood out for their personalized relationships with each man, with whom they sometimes had long-term connections. These women lived in their own homes, and some were fully supported by their lovers. By the way, I came across a list of affectionate nicknames that ancient Greek men used for their women: little grape, honeycomb, little bunny, dove, snail, little frog, and even fly. I must admit, some of these compliments sound quite strange, but men apparently found them sincere and fitting. Another interesting observation: the ancient Greeks knew how to enhance erections. They used aphrodisiacs like onions, mussels, crabs, snails, aged wine, honey, and eggs. A typical morning ritual for an ancient Greek girl included caring for her appearance. Of course, they brushed their teeth, as fresh breath was important. Their skin had to be light and clear, so the girls used various cosmetic products. In the morning, a caravan of servants would arrive with jars and bottles, powder, blush for the cheeks, and mascara for the eyelashes. Special attention was paid to curling their hair, for which they used iron tongs heated over a low flame. Once all the curls were perfectly done, they could get dressed. The clothing of ancient Greek women was quite revealing. Most often, they wore light fabrics that hardly covered anything. Women would wrap their breasts with special bands, and on their feet, they wore brightly colored sandals. Jewelry also played an important role: earrings, bracelets for the arms and legs. Fashion, of course, changed, but Greek women always aimed to look attractive. By the way, they also practiced hair removal, using hot ash for the process, which was clearly not pleasant. The most beautiful and graceful women in Greece were considered to be the hetaira. One of the most famous was Aspasia, the very same wife of Pericles. She was not only attractive but also well-versed in philosophy and a talented speaker. This, of course, attracted Pericles. For an educated man like him, intellectual connection meant just as much as physical attraction. Interestingly, Aspasia was not from Athens, but from Miletus, which made her a foreigner and an outsider in the eyes of the locals. Nevertheless, Pericles left his first wife and married Aspasia. This elevated her political influence, as she actively participated in the city's affairs and helped Pericles make decisions. When the war with Samos began, Pericles' opponents immediately remembered that Aspasia was from Miletus and accused her of convincing him to defend her native city. However, the real cause of the war was the need to preserve the naval alliance of the Greek states. Some researchers believe that Pericles' relationship with Aspasia was politically motivated. But that's hard to believe, as she had no citizenship and was a hetaira. According to other accounts, before her relationship with Pericles, Aspasia organized a school in Athens where she brought beautiful girls and educated them. These girls may also have been hetaira, although there's no exact evidence. Aspasia also organized something like intellectual salons, attended by notable figures such as the sculptor Phidias, philosophers Anaxagoras and Socrates, and historian Herodotus. This, of course, upset Pericles' opponents since Greek wives were expected to stay at home, not organize intellectual gatherings. One of the most famous episodes involving Aspasia was a court case in which she was accused of impiety and procuring. At the trial, Pericles, usually a calm and confident speaker, was so shaken that he stumbled over his words and eventually broke down in tears. This moved the judges, and Aspasia was acquitted. However, many historians believe this story is fictional. Pericles' opponents, such as the poet Hermippus, often ridiculed him in their works, and this legend may have been a later myth. The life of Aspasia and Pericles was far from carefree. When the Peloponnesian War began, Athens was struck by a plague that took the lives of Pericles and his sons from his first marriage. Their son with Aspasia survived, grew up, and also became a general, but was later sentenced to death for mistakes in a battle with Sparta. After Pericles' death, Aspasia was left almost alone, having outlived many of those close to her. She was an extraordinary woman who witnessed the flourishing of Athens' golden age, and her influence on Pericles and his circle was undoubtedly significant. This era became the foundation for many cultural and scientific achievements later inherited by the Romans. 1,000 years later, during the Renaissance, ancient values reignited interest in the beauty of the naked human body, which had been taboo during the Middle Ages. One of the symbols of this revival was Sandro Botticelli's painting The Birth of Venus, depicting the goddess of love, Aphrodite, emerging from the sea foam. The love served by the Hetaira, and Aspasia herself, perhaps symbolizes the very spark that inspired ancient art, philosophy, and life. To paraphrase Dostoevsky, perhaps it is through love that the world is saved, even in such an unusual form as it was in ancient Greece. It's worth noting that brothels and paid love were part of everyday life. Corinth, a port city, was famous for its numerous brothels, and a saying emerged, "Not everyone can afford Corinth," highlighting the high cost of local pleasures. Corinth also housed a temple to Aphrodite, where many priestesses were ready at any moment to offer their services. In addition to elite Hetaira, there were also more accessible prostitutes in Greece who worked for themselves. Some girls would walk the streets, wearing shoes with inscriptions on the soles that left messages like, "Follow me," imprinted on the ground. This way, potential clients could understand that the women were part of the sex trade. Prostitution was not seen as shameful, and brothels were a common part of life in large cities, especially in ports and trading centers. In Athens, there were even state-owned brothels, attributed to the wise lawmaker Solon. These establishments were affordable to nearly everyone, with low-cost entry. The girls in these brothels were displayed in light, transparent clothing or fully nude, and clients could choose from them. This was the cheapest form of prostitution, and the girls had to give small gifts to their clients to make a living. Interestingly, in the public eye, it was more acceptable to engage with prostitutes than to have affairs with married women. The Greeks believed that this helped maintain order within families while satisfying men's sexual desires outside the bonds of marriage. Now we come to one of the most controversial topics in the history of ancient Greece: relationships between men and boys. Ancient Greeks are often labeled as a homosexual culture, but that's not entirely accurate. It's difficult for us to understand their views on sexual relationships because they didn't have modern concepts of sexual orientation. For the Greeks, love was a pursuit of beauty, and it was often directed toward young boys. Such relationships between older men and boys were a part of archaic and classical culture, especially in Sparta and Crete, where they served as initiation rituals, a sort of passage into adulthood. These bonds were part of the educational system, where an older mentor would teach a young boy both physically and spiritually. Hans Licht, in his book Sexual Life in Ancient Greece, notes that pederasty was viewed by the Greeks as an important means of educating youth. It not only contributed to the harmonious development of both body and soul, but also strengthened bonds within the male population of the polis. It's important to note that sexual relationships between adult men were considered shameful and were condemned by society. The history of homoerotic relationships in ancient Greece, despite being controversial from a modern perspective, was an integral part of their culture and the upbringing of young men. Such relationships developed not only in Athens but also in Sparta, where they played a special role in military training. These relationships between older men and young boys were seen as a way to transmit knowledge, foster courage, and instill virtue. Another interesting aspect of Greek culture was how these relationships influenced political and social life. Many young men who engaged in such relationships later held high positions in government and continued their ties with their mentors. These connections reinforced cohesion among the male citizens of the polis, which also contributed to political stability. Such views and customs, of course, seem strange and unacceptable in modern society, where rights and ethical standards are vastly different. Today, sexual relationships with minors are strictly prohibited and prosecuted by law. However, in ancient Greece, these were part of the social structure and didn't provoke the same condemnation as they do in the modern world. This is one of the features of ancient Greek culture that strikes us with its uniqueness and contradictions. It's interesting that such relationships didn't imply physical violence or coercion. If a boy or his father opposed a relationship with a man, the man would simply back off. These bonds lasted until the boy reached adulthood and got married. Afterward, the relationships ended and the man transitioned to a traditional family life. However, sexual relationships between adult men were not approved by Greek society. These were considered immoral, and Greek society condemned such bonds. The Greeks admired the beauty of the naked human body, especially the male form. Boys spent 3/4 of their day in baths, gymnasiums, and sports arenas, where they could be seen naked. Even in Greek vase painting, young men were depicted more often than women. Many inscriptions on the vases read "beautiful boy," emphasizing the special attention given to youthful beauty. Let's return to Pericles and Aspasia. They had 2 daughters and a son, who was named Pericles after his father. However, according to Athenian law, Aspasia's children could not obtain citizenship because she wasn't a citizen of the city. This created difficulties for their family, and Pericles' opponents, especially the oligarchs, tried to use this fact against him. They began by accusing the sculptor Phidias, who worked on the Acropolis and the Parthenon. A lengthy trial against Phidias was just the first part of the attacks on Pericles and his circle. Next, the focus turned to Aspasia herself. She was accused of impiety and procuring, which were serious crimes in Athens at the time. Hermippus, a staunch opponent of Pericles, led the charges in court, trying to portray Aspasia as a woman who violated the moral and religious norms of society. However, Pericles himself stepped in to defend his wife, though he usually didn't get involved in such matters. During the trial, he was unusually nervous and even wept, which moved the judges. Despite the pressure, Aspasia was acquitted. This story, though dramatic, might be a myth that developed later among the people. Hermippus was known for his satirical works mocking Pericles, and the trial of Aspasia could be the result of his imagination. Nevertheless, their lives didn't become any easier afterward. The Peloponnesian War began, a difficult time for Athens. The city was weakened, and soon it was struck by the plague, which claimed many lives, including Pericles and his sons from his first marriage. The only son of Pericles and Aspasia survived, but his fate was also tragic. He grew up and, like his father, became a general and military leader. However, after defeating the Spartan fleet in 406 BC, he and his comrades were sentenced to death for failing to recover the bodies of fallen soldiers from the battlefield. This was a devastating blow to Aspasia, who had lost nearly all her loved ones. Her life and fate reflected many aspects of ancient Greece, from political struggles and social limitations to the grandeur of love and tragedy. Aspasia was an extraordinary woman, whose name remains in history as a symbol of intellectual strength and independence. After Pericles' death, as Athens gradually lost its former greatness, his era remained in memory as a golden age. The achievements of that time, philosophy, art, and science, became the foundation for all subsequent European development. This influence was especially seen in the Romans, who adopted many of the Greeks' cultural accomplishments. Thousands of years later, during the Renaissance, ancient ideas about beauty and the human body shone once again. One of the most vivid examples of this is Sandro Botticelli's painting The Birth of Venus, which essentially glorifies the Greek goddess Aphrodite, the goddess of love. The Greeks believed that love and beauty could change the world. And, in many ways, they were right. Their philosophical discussions on passion, eroticism, and love still resonate in modern culture today. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.